In 1972, a single photograph transformed America's most desired actress into the nation's most hated woman. It wasn't a sex scandal. It wasn't a violent crime. It was an image. Jane Fonda, sitting on an enemy anti-aircraft gun, smiling, while young Americans were dying in combat on the other side of the world. Veterans spit on her in airports. Theaters refused to show her films. Organized groups burned her image in public squares. The hatred didn't last months. It lasted decades. 30 years of relentless fury that transformed an Oscar winner into a synonym for national betrayal. But what no one saw in that photo was the truth behind the smile. A woman who spent her entire life desperately seeking approval from a father who never loved her, who became an empty sex symbol, who won 2 Oscars and heard from her father only, "That's nice, dear," who built a fitness empire while hating herself inside, who lost herself in powerful men because she didn't know who she was. How did the daughter of a Hollywood legend become America's most despised woman? What wound led her to sit on that gun? And why, decades later, do veterans still refuse to forgive her? How does someone survive being hated by an entire nation and still transform into an icon, activist, and finally, a free woman? Before we understand the fall, the betrayal, and the redemption, we need to go back to the beginning. Because Jane Fonda's story doesn't start in Hanoi. It starts in a silent house, with a father made of ice and a mother who chose death as her only escape. Born December 21, 1937, in New York City, Jane Seymour Fonda entered a world that shimmered with fame but fractured beneath the surface. Her father, Henry Fonda, was already ascending to become one of Hollywood's most revered actors. Tall, stoic, magnetic on screen, he possessed a gift for portraying moral integrity and quiet strength. But at home, that warmth vanished. Henry was a man of stone, emotionally unreachable, incapable of offering the affection his children craved. Jane would later confess, "I spent my whole life trying to make my father see me, and he never did." That absence, small as it might sound to others, became the axis around which her entire existence would turn. Her mother, Frances Ford Seymour, was a fragile beauty trapped in a gilded cage, elegant, troubled, suffering silently under the weight of a marriage that offered no emotional safety. Frances adored her children, but she was unraveling, spiraling into mental illness that neither medicine nor wealth could contain. Jane remembers a house filled with unspoken tension, where her mother's smile would crack without warning, where her father's silence filled every room like ice. "I knew something was wrong," Jane recalled decades later, "but no one explained anything. We just lived in fear." In 1950, when Jane was only 12 years old, her world shattered. Frances was admitted to a psychiatric institution, and there, alone and abandoned, she took her own life. The official story fed to Jane and her brother Peter was a lie. They were told their mother died of a heart attack. Jane would not learn the truth for months, stumbling upon it in a magazine at a friend's house. The betrayal was double-edged. Not only had she lost her mother, but her father had lied to her about how. Henry never spoke of Frances again. He forbade her name in the house, erased her photographs, and moved forward as if grief could be silenced through sheer willpower. For Jane, the message was clear. Emotions were dangerous. Vulnerability was weakness. And love was something you performed, not something you felt. She would spend the next 4 decades trying to unlearn those lies. School became another battlefield. At Emma Willard School, a prestigious boarding institution, Jane was surrounded by girls from powerful families, but she felt like an imposter. Pretty, yes, but hollow. She learned early to wear masks, to perform the role of the confident girl while drowning inside. Her father remarried quickly, choosing a young socialite named Susan Blanchard. Jane tried desperately to bond with her new stepmother, but the relationship was transactional at best. Henry remained distant, unreachable, a towering figure whose approval Jane chased but never earned. By her late teens, Jane had learned a devastating lesson. She was not enough. Not pretty enough to hold her father's attention. Not perfect enough to fill the void her mother left. Not worthy of the love she so desperately needed. And so she began a pattern that would haunt her for decades. She sought validation in the eyes of men, in the approval of strangers, in any mirror that might reflect back the worth her father refused to give. Years later, Jane would say with brutal honesty, "I became whoever men wanted me to be, because I had no idea who I was." The girl starved of her father's love was becoming a woman addicted to external validation. And that addiction would lead her down paths of brilliance, destruction, and eventually hard-won freedom. But first, she had to step onto the stage her father built and try to prove she belonged there. By her early 20s, Jane Fonda had learned to survive by becoming whatever others needed her to be. Beautiful, charming, agreeable. But beneath the polished exterior lived a woman with no center, no sense of self, only an aching need to be seen by the one man who refused to look. In 1958, she followed her father into the family business, not out of passion, but out of desperation. If Henry Fonda would not love her as a daughter, perhaps he would acknowledge her as an actress. She studied at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, learning the craft her father had mastered. Every line she memorized felt like a plea. Every performance, an audition for his affection. Her film debut came in 1960 with Tall Story, a light-hearted comedy that showcased her beauty, but little else. Critics dismissed it. Audiences barely noticed. But Jane kept pushing, driven by a hunger that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with a father's silence. Then came Roger Vadim, French, charismatic, a director famous for transforming women into sexual icons, most notably Brigitte Bardot. When he met Jane in 1963, he saw not a wounded girl seeking approval, but raw material to be sculpted into his next masterpiece. Jane, desperate for love and still learning to mistake control for care, fell quickly. They married in 1965, and almost immediately, she began disappearing into the fantasy he created. Vadim wanted a siren, so Jane became one. He wanted her thin, so she starved herself. He wanted her bold, so she performed in ways that made her uncomfortable but earned his fleeting approval. In 1968, Barbarella premiered. Jane, clad in futuristic costumes that left little to the imagination, became an overnight sex symbol. Posters of her filled college dorms. Men desired her. Women envied her. And Jane felt nothing but emptiness. "I hated every moment of it," she would confess decades later. "I felt like a piece of meat on display. But I did it because I thought that's what love required." She had traded her father's rejection for Vadim's objectification, and the price was the slow erasure of herself. And yet, even in the midst of that emptiness, something inside her refused to die. Beneath the sex symbol image, beneath the submission to Vadim's vision, Jane began to discover something dangerous. Anger. Anger at being molded. Anger at being silenced. Anger at a world that valued her body but dismissed her mind. By 1968, America was tearing itself apart. The Vietnam War raged. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Cities burned with riots. College campuses erupted in protest. And Jane, for the first time in her life, began to pay attention to something beyond her own desperate need for validation. She started reading, attending rallies, listening to voices that spoke of justice, equality, and resistance. It was tentative at first, hesitant, like a person learning to walk after years of paralysis. But slowly, the woman who had spent her entire life performing for men began to discover a voice of her own. In 1969, she left Vadim. The marriage had become a cage, and Jane, for the first time, chose freedom over approval. It was terrifying, liberating, and it marked the beginning of a transformation that would cost her everything. But before the world turned against her, before she became the most hated woman in America, Jane experienced a strange, bittersweet vindication. She began landing serious roles, films that demanded not her body, but her talent. They shoot horses, don't they? In 1969, earned her the first Academy Award nomination. Critics who had dismissed her as a pretty face suddenly took notice. And then, in 1971, came Clute. Playing a call girl entangled in a murder investigation, Jane delivered a performance so raw, so fearless, that it could not be ignored. At the 1972 Academy Awards, her name was called. Jane Fonda, Best Actress. She walked to the stage, accepted the golden statue, and in that moment felt a flicker of something she had chased her entire life: worth. But when she looked into the audience, searching for her father's face, Henry Fonda's expression was unreadable. Polite, distant, the same cold mask he had worn her entire life. "I won an Oscar," Jane later recalled, "and my father said, 'That's nice, dear.' That was it. That's all I got. No embrace, no pride. Just the same silence that had haunted her since childhood. The validation she craved would never come from him. And somewhere deep inside, Jane began to realize that perhaps it never would. Perhaps the approval she needed could only come from within. But she didn't know how to find it. Not yet. What she did know was that the world was on fire, that injustice was everywhere, and that her voice, finally, could be used for something beyond begging to be loved. The girl who had spent her life performing for her father's attention was about to step onto a stage far more dangerous than Hollywood. She was about to become political, and for that, America would never forgive her. By 1970, Jane Fonda was no longer content to be a beautiful face reading lines written by men. The Academy Award sitting on her shelf felt hollow. The fame felt meaningless. For the first time in her life, she looked beyond the mirror and saw a world drowning in injustice she could no longer ignore. America was at war with itself. Young men were being drafted, sent to Vietnam, and returning in body bags or broken beyond repair. College campuses erupted in protests. The government responded with violence. And Jane, whose entire life had been defined by silence and submission, decided she would be silent no more. She joined the anti-war movement with the intensity of someone who had spent 30 years suppressing her own voice. She attended rallies, gave speeches, used her fame as a platform. She aligned herself with the Black Panthers, speaking out against racism and police brutality. She visited Native American reservations, shining light on injustices most Americans refused to see. The press turned on her instantly. The same magazines that had once fawned over her beauty now called her a radical, a communist, a traitor. Death threats poured in. Veterans groups demanded she be silenced. But Jane, for perhaps the first time in her life, felt alive. "I finally had a purpose," she would say later. "I wasn't performing for anyone. I was fighting for something real." The validation she had chased from her father, from Vadim, from Hollywood, suddenly felt irrelevant compared to the clarity of a cause. But conviction, however pure, does not guarantee wisdom. And in 1972, Jane made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In July of that year, she accepted an invitation to visit North Vietnam. Her goal, she claimed, was to witness firsthand the impact of American bombing on civilians, to see the human cost of a war she believed was unjust. She later explained, "I wanted to show Americans what we were really doing. I thought I could help end the war." For 2 weeks, she toured Hanoi. She visited hospitals filled with wounded children. She saw bombed villages reduced to rubble. She met with North Vietnamese leaders and recorded radio broadcasts condemning American military actions. And then came the moment that would define her forever. Photographers led her to an anti-aircraft gun battery, the very weapons used to shoot down American pilots. Someone suggested she sit on the gun. Laughing, swept up in the moment, Jane climbed aboard. The cameras clicked. She smiled. And in that instant, her life, as she knew it, ended. The photograph spread like wildfire. Jane Fonda, Oscar-winning actress, daughter of Henry Fonda, sitting on an enemy weapon, smiling as if the war were a game. To millions of Americans, it was not just a mistake. It was betrayal. It was treason. Veterans who had survived the war, who had watched friends die, who carried scars both visible and invisible, saw that photo and felt rage unlike anything they had ever known. She was not just protesting the war. She was sitting with the enemy. She was mocking their sacrifice. Overnight, Jane transformed from controversial activist into Hanoi Jane, the most hated woman in America. Her films were boycotted. Theaters refused to show them. She received death threats so severe, the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file on her that would eventually span thousands of pages. Veterans groups called for her arrest. Politicians demanded she be tried for treason. And the hatred did not fade. It followed her like a shadow for decades. In airports, strangers spit on her. At public events, protesters screamed obscenities. Vietnam veterans swore they would never forgive her. Some never did. Even decades later, long after the war ended, the sight of her name could ignite fury in those who had served. Jane tried to explain. She claimed she had been manipulated, that she hadn't understood what the photo would symbolize, that her intentions were to end suffering, not mock soldiers. But her explanation sounded hollow to those who had bled for their country. Years later, in 1988, she would issue her first public apology. "I will go to my grave regretting the photograph of me in an anti-aircraft gun," she said, her voice breaking. "It was the most horrible thing I could possibly have done. It was thoughtless and cruel. But apologies, no matter how sincere, cannot undo the past." The damage was permanent. Her career, which had been ascending toward legendary status, collapsed. Major studios refused to work with her. Endorsements vanished. The woman who had won an Oscar just a year before the photo now found herself persona non grata in her own country. And perhaps the cruelest irony was that her father, Henry Fonda, the man whose approval she had chased her entire life, was humiliated by her actions. He, the stoic patriot who played American heroes on screen, now had a daughter labeled a traitor. He never publicly defended her. never stood by her side. The silence she had endured as a child returned, now laced with shame. He was mortified, Jane admitted decades later, and I knew I had disappointed him. Again. Even in her rebellion, even in her attempt to find her own voice, she had somehow managed to fail the one test that mattered most to her wounded inner child. The psychological toll was immense. Jane had stepped into activism seeking purpose, seeking to be something more than a pretty face. Instead, she became a symbol of everything divided about America. Hated by millions, rejected by the industry she had conquered, and estranged from the father she still longed to please. She withdrew from the spotlight, retreated into relationships that offered temporary shelter, but no real peace. The woman who had finally found her voice was learning the devastating lesson that sometimes speaking out comes at a cost so high it feels like annihilation. But Jane Fonda had survived her mother's death, her father's coldness, Vadim's objectification, and Hollywood's cruelty. And she would survive this too, not by erasing the past, but by learning to carry it. The question was no longer whether she could be forgiven. The question was whether she could forgive herself, and that answer would take decades to find. Exiled from Hollywood, despised by millions, Jane Fonda could have disappeared into obscurity. Many expected her to. Some hoped she would. But the girl who had survived her mother's death and her father's coldness was not built to surrender. If she could not be forgiven, she would reinvent herself. Again, and again, and again. In 1973, still radioactive from the Hanoi photo, Jane married Tom Hayden, a radical activist and one of the founders of the Students for a Democratic Society. To outsiders, it seemed like a natural pairing, two revolutionaries united in their cause. But those close to Jane saw something familiar and tragic. Another man whose approval she desperately sought. Another relationship where she became whoever he needed her to be. Hayden was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly consumed by politics. Jane threw herself into his campaigns, organizing, fundraising, and using what remained of her fame to support his work. She gave birth to their son, Troy, in 1973, and later adopted a daughter, Mary, in 1982. She tried to be the perfect political wife, the devoted mother, the tireless organizer. But beneath the activism, the old pattern continued. I lost myself in Tom just like I had lost myself in Vadim, she would admit years later. I thought if I was useful enough, needed enough, maybe I'd finally feel whole. She wasn't fighting for her own beliefs anymore. She was fighting to keep a man's love. Yet even as her personal life fractured under the weight of performance, Jane began a professional resurrection that stunned everyone who had written her off. In 1978, she returned to film with Coming Home, a searing drama about the Vietnam War's impact on soldiers and families. Playing a woman transformed by her relationship with a paralyzed veteran, Jane delivered a performance so honest, so vulnerable, that even her harshest critics had to acknowledge her talent. At the 1979 Academy Awards, her name was called again. Jane Fonda, Best Actress, her second Oscar. Standing on that stage, she did not thank her father. She thanked the veterans who had shared their stories, the real heroes whose pain she had tried to honor. It was not forgiveness. America still hated Hanoi Jane, but it was acknowledgement that her talent could not be erased, no matter how despised she had become. And Jane, learning to separate worth from approval, felt something shift inside her. She could act, she could create, and she didn't need permission to do either. Then came the China syndrome, in 1979, a thriller about nuclear power that became both a critical and commercial hit. And in 1981, the role that would finally give her what she had chased since childhood. On Golden Pond, alongside her father, Henry Fonda. It was his final film. At 76, dying of heart disease, Henry finally agreed to work with his daughter. For Jane, it was the collaboration she had dreamed of since she first stepped onto a soundstage. Playing a daughter desperate for her father's affection, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Every scene felt like therapy. Every line, a confession. Henry won the Academy Award for Best Actor. Jane accepted it on his behalf, as he was too ill to attend. Standing on that stage, holding her father's Oscar, she wept. Not for the award, but for the lifetime of distance that even this triumph could not bridge. Months later, Henry Fonda died, and Jane was left with an Oscar, a lifetime of unanswered questions, and the devastating realization that she would never hear the words she had always needed. "I never got to hear him say he was proud of me," she confessed in her memoir, and that absence never stopped hurting. But Jane had learned something crucial through those films. She didn't need Hollywood's forgiveness or her father's approval to have value. Her talent was undeniable. Her resilience, unbreakable. And if the world wouldn't give her redemption, she would create her own empire. In 1982, Jane released Jane Fonda's Workout, a VHS exercise tape that would become a cultural phenomenon. Wearing bright leotards and leg warmers, she led millions of women through aerobics routines in their living rooms. It was revolutionary. Fitness had been male-dominated, intimidating, inaccessible. Jane made it fun, empowering, and democratic. The tape sold 17 million copies, becoming the best-selling VHS of all time. Suddenly, Jane wasn't just an actress or an activist. She was a fitness mogul. The workout videos spawned an empire. Books, merchandise, entire franchises. She became wealthier than she had ever been, not from acting, but from teaching women they could be strong. "It gave me power I had never felt before," she later said. "I wasn't asking for anyone's approval. I was building something entirely my own." For the first time, Jane Fonda controlled the narrative. She wasn't the sex symbol Vadim created. She wasn't the radical activist. She wasn't even just Henry Fonda's daughter. She was Jane, and women around the world were following her lead. But even as her empire grew, her marriage to Hayden crumbled. By 1990, after 17 years together, they divorced. Jane admitted she had spent nearly 2 decades trying to be the woman he needed, rather than discovering who she actually was. The pattern, once again, had repeated. And then came Ted Turner, media mogul, founder of CNN, larger than life, brilliant and volatile. When they met in 1991, Jane was 53, and Turner was everything her previous partners had been: commanding, charismatic, and utterly consuming. They married in 1991, and once again, Jane disappeared into a man's world. She stopped acting, stopped her fitness empire, moved to Turner's Montana ranch, and became, in her own words, Ted's wife. She attended his business meetings, supported his ventures, and tried to be the partner he wanted. She even converted to Christianity to please him, attending evangelical services despite her own doubts. Friends watched in dismay as Jane, who had built an empire and survived national hatred, shrank herself to fit into yet another man's life. "I thought I had finally learned," she later said, her voice thick with regret. "But I hadn't. I was still that little girl desperate for Daddy's love, just finding it in different men." The marriage lasted 10 years. By 2001, it was over. Turner admitted he had never stopped seeing other women. Jane admitted she had never stopped losing herself. At 63, she found herself divorced again, questioning everything she thought she had learned. But this time, something was different. Jane didn't immediately search for another relationship to fill the void. She didn't rush into another reinvention. For the first time in her life, she stopped, sat with the silence, and began the hardest work she had ever done: learning to be alone. She entered therapy, started journaling, began excavating the wounds she had spent decades burying beneath activism, fitness routines, and the needs of powerful men. She wrote a memoir, My Life So Far, published in 2005, where she laid bare every mistake, every regret, every desperate attempt to be loved. I realized I had been running my entire life, she wrote, running from my mother's death, running from my father's coldness, running from myself, and all that running had gotten me nowhere. At 68 years old, Jane Fonda finally stopped running. And in that stillness, she began to discover who she actually was. Not an actress, not an activist, not a wife, just Jane, wounded, resilient, still standing. The reinventions had been survival mechanisms, ways of proving she mattered when she didn't believe she did. But now, for the first time, she was ready to build something different. Not an empire, not a persona, but a life rooted in truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. The woman who had been America's sweetheart, then America's traitor, then America's fitness guru, was about to become something else entirely. A woman who finally, devastatingly, knew herself. By her early 70s, Jane Fonda had survived more lives than most people ever live. She had been a sex symbol, a radical, a traitor, a fitness icon, and a woman who repeatedly lost herself in the shadows of powerful men. But in the quiet years after her divorce from Ted Turner, something remarkable happened. She stopped performing, and in that stillness, she finally found herself. In 2015, at 77 years old, Jane returned to acting in a way that felt less like reinvention and more like homecoming. Grace and Frankie, a Netflix series about two women in their 70s navigating life after their husbands leave them for each other, became an unexpected phenomenon. Playing Grace, a sharp-tongued, uptight businesswoman forced to rebuild her identity, Jane wasn't acting. She was excavating. The show ran for 7 seasons, becoming Netflix's longest-running original series. But more than the success, what mattered was the message. Here was Jane Fonda, in her late 70s and early 80s, playing a woman discovering that life doesn't end at 70. That desire, ambition, humor, and relevance don't have expiration dates. I'm playing a woman who is finally learning to be herself, Jane said in an interview. And I realized that's what I've been doing too. It just took me 75 years to get here. The role earned her multiple Emmy nominations and reminded the world that Jane Fonda, controversial as she remained, was an undeniable force. But the real transformation was happening off-screen. Jane had begun a new kind of activism, one tempered by decades of mistakes and wisdom. In 2019, at 81 years old, inspired by teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg, Jane launched Fire Drill Fridays. Every Friday, she and other activists gathered at the U.S. Capitol to protest government inaction on climate change. And she got arrested. Again and again. At 81, 82, 83 years old, Jane Fonda was led away in handcuffs, her white hair and calm dignity captured by every camera present. Some mocked her, called it a publicity stunt, But those who watched closely saw something different. This wasn't the reckless radical of 1972. This was a woman who had learned how to fight strategically, how to use her fame not to glorify herself, but to amplify a cause. "I'm old," she said plainly. "I don't have much time left, and I'll be damned if I waste it being comfortable while the planet burns." There was no ego in it, no performance, just the clear-eyed urgency of someone who had finally learned to separate conviction from the need for approval. And perhaps, most remarkably, Jane began the painful, necessary work of reconciliation. For decades, Vietnam veterans had refused to forgive her. The photograph from Hanoi remained, for many, an unforgivable betrayal. But Jane stopped defending herself and started listening. She met with veterans, sat with their pain, heard their stories without trying to justify her actions. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply acknowledged the harm she had caused. "I will never stop apologizing," she said in a 2015 interview. "What I did was thoughtless and cruel, and no amount of good intentions can undo that." Some veterans accepted her apologies. Many never would. But what changed was Jane's understanding that forgiveness was not something she could demand or earn. It was something she had to make peace with never receiving. And in accepting that, she found a strange, bittersweet freedom. Her relationship with her body also transformed. The woman who had starved herself for Vadim, who had built a fitness empire, who had undergone cosmetic procedures to fight aging, finally made peace with time. In interviews, she spoke candidly about her knee replacements, her struggles with cancer, the reality of an aging body. "I wasted so much time hating my body," she admitted, "trying to make it smaller, younger, more acceptable. Now I'm just grateful it still works." She stopped dyeing her hair, letting silver replace blonde. She spoke openly about the relief of no longer being objectified, of finally being judged for her mind rather than her appearance. "There is freedom in being old," she said with a laugh. "Nobody expects me to be sexy anymore. What a gift that is." It was a radical statement from a woman who had built her early career on beauty, and it resonated with millions of women who had spent lifetimes performing femininity in ways that exhausted them. But perhaps the deepest healing came through her grandchildren. Jane, who had struggled to mother her own children while lost in her various personas, found unexpected redemption as a grandmother. She spoke often of Malcolm and Viva, her son Troy's children, with a tenderness that seemed new. "I get to love them without all the baggage," she explained. "I'm not trying to be perfect anymore. I'm just present." She taught them about activism, about fighting for what's right, but also about joy, about silliness, about being fully human. The grandmother they knew bore little resemblance to the driven, wounded woman who had raised their father. Jane also reconciled with her own children. Troy and Mary, who had grown up with a mother often absent, consumed by causes or men, had carried their own wounds. But in her later years, Jane did something she had never learned from her own father. She apologized. She acknowledged her failures as a mother. She told them the truth about her struggles. "I wasn't the mother they deserved," she said plainly in her second memoir, published in 2020. "I was too broken, too lost in my own pain. But I'm trying now to be the grandmother they need." It wasn't redemption. It was accountability. And in that honesty, her relationships with her children began, slowly, to heal. In 2022, Jane revealed she had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. At 84, facing cancer, she approached it with the same unflinching honesty she had finally learned to apply to everything. She documented her chemotherapy on social media, spoke openly about her fear and her hope, and reminded the world that even legends are mortal. "Cancer is a teacher," she wrote. "It teaches you what matters. And what matters is love, connection, and how you use whatever time you have left." The treatment was successful. She went into remission. But the experience deepened something already growing in her. The understanding that legacy is not about perfection, but about growth. At 86, Jane Fonda is not trying to be forgiven. She is not trying to be loved by everyone. She is not chasing her father's ghost or disappearing into another man's shadow. She is simply being Jane, flawed and fierce, wounded and wise, still fighting but finally at peace with the woman staring back from the mirror. "I spent 75 years becoming who I thought I should be," she said recently. "Now I'm just being who I am. And that's enough." For the girl who was never enough for her father, who was never enough for herself, that sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. The reconciliation was not with America, though some had softened toward her. It was not with Hollywood, though she remained relevant. It was with herself. And in that reconciliation, Jane Fonda became something she had never been before: free. In 2024, at 86 years old, Jane Fonda stands not as a woman seeking redemption, but as one who has learned that redemption is not the point. She lives quietly in Los Angeles, her days shaped not by spotlights, but by rhythms that would have seemed impossible to the woman she once was. Morning walks, time with grandchildren, books, activism that feels less like performance and more like purpose. Her body, once her currency and her prison, now simply carries her forward. 2 knee replacements. Cancer survived. A spine that aches when it rains. She moves more slowly now, speaks more softly, but with a clarity that eluded her for most of her life. "I like who I am now," she said recently, a statement so simple it carries the weight of 86 years. Her fortune, estimated at over $200 million, accumulated from decades of films, fitness empires, and wise investments, sits largely untouched. She lives modestly, drives herself to protests, donates millions to climate causes and women's organizations. The wealth her father accumulated through stoic heroes, and her own through countless reinventions, matters less now than how it's used. "Money can't buy back time," she said more than once, "but it can fund the future for those who still have time to fight." Serious. She has pledged the majority of her estate to environmental and social justice causes, ensuring that long after she's gone, the work continues. Her IMDb page spans 6 decades, 2 Academy Awards, 7 nominations, countless other accolades. But when asked about her proudest achievement, Jane doesn't mention the Oscars or the workout empire. She mentions her grandchildren. "They know a version of me my own children never got to meet," she says, "the version that's finally honest." She remains controversial. To some, she will always be Hanoi Jane, the traitor who sat on an enemy gun. No amount of apologies, no decades of different work will ever erase that photograph from their memory. And Jane has made peace with that. She doesn't ask for universal forgiveness anymore. She simply lives with the truth of what she did and who she's become since. "I can't change the past," she said in her most recent interview. "I can only be honest about it and try to do better going forward. That's all any of us can do." It's a lesson that took her 8 decades to learn, but one she now embodies fully. Her legacy is not one of perfection. It is one of transformation. She was the girl starved of her father's love who spent 75 years seeking it in all the wrong places. The woman who became a sex symbol, a radical, a traitor, a mogul, always performing. always becoming whoever others needed her to be. And finally, in her 70s and 80s, the woman who stopped performing and simply became herself. "I wasted so much time trying to be perfect," she reflected recently. "Trying to be thin enough, political enough, devoted enough, successful enough. And none of it made me happy because I was never doing it for me." The girl who heard her father say, "That's nice, dear," when she won an Oscar, finally understands that no external validation could ever fill the void he left. But here is what makes Jane Fonda's story matter. She kept going. Through her mother's death, her father's coldness, national hatred, failed marriages, public humiliation, and her own destructive patterns, she kept going. She stumbled, she failed, she hurt people and was hurt in return. But she never stopped trying to become more honest, more whole, more real. At 86, facing the twilight of an extraordinary and painful life, Jane Fonda offers us something more valuable than a flawless hero. She offers us the truth of what it means to be human. Broken, resilient, capable of terrible mistakes and remarkable growth, forever imperfect, and yet, somehow, enough. Her father never said he was proud of her, but Jane, finally, can say she's proud of herself. Not for the Oscars or the empire, but for the courage it took to stop running, to face her demons, to admit her failures, and to keep fighting for what matters, even when the world refused to forgive her. "I don't need to be remembered as perfect," she said recently, her voice steady and sure. "I just want to be remembered as someone who tried, who fell, who got back up, who changed." And in that simple hope lies the real legacy of Jane Fonda. Not the roles she played, not the causes she championed, but the transformation she chose again and again, even when it would have been easier to stay broken. She proves that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be, that growth has no expiration date, that the greatest act of rebellion is learning, finally, to be free. Now, dear viewer, her story turns to you. What will you take from Jane's journey? That mistakes don't define us if we're willing to learn from them? That seeking validation from others is a prison we must escape? That it's never too late to change? Jane Fonda's life reminds us that legends are not born perfect. They are forged in failure, shame, resilience, and the relentless choice to keep growing even when the world has already decided who you are. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more untold stories. And remember, the greatest legacy is not a life without regret, but a life that never stopped becoming more honest, more brave, more whole. For in every scar, in every mistake, Jane Fonda shows us the ultimate truth, that freedom comes not from being loved by everyone, but from finally learning to be enough for yourself.